actually, why don't we shift this down? Because
Hello.
and then actually, yeah, me, and then actually take these unless he shows up.
Okay.
You know,
Take Tocasio unless you choose.
yeah. And maybe put like denim there. They normally
And then I have all of our members. I mean, we have all of the
Right.
ones, and then I have all of our members and all of the DEM members.
So as members come, they'll sit wherever and just put a little placard for them in front of them.
Wherever they want to sit. So we're letting them know. So do we want to just pull Denham to wherever he wants to sit?
Yeah, and FASO is here. So wherever. So have his ready.
If you have the things.
Denham to wherever he wants to sit.
Need anything?
Yeah.
Here, we'll get started.
Do I?
I just, yes, wherever Elliot wants to sit.
Only loving. High vibes into the universe.
Let's go. We go rock and roll.
Wherever you want to sit.
Be fine.
Used to being next to Joanne.
Just sit on the Democrat.
Here's your nameplate.
Oh, I thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Wherever you'd like to sit.
You don't have to speak. I mean, I think he's going to say.
Meeting will come to order. I am pleased to welcome all of our participants today. Previously, we held a series of roundtables to focus on getting a handle on the large number of expiring GSA leases. The roundtables provided an opportunity for this subcommittee, GSA, GSA's tenant agencies, and the private sector to have meaningful discussions on how best to approach those leases to save taxpayer dollars. The roundtables proved to be effective in getting agencies to rethink how they use and manage their spaces. The goal of today's roundtable is to begin a similar discussion on the Federal Real Property Profile Database, or FRPP, and look at how it can be effectively used to improve the management of federal real estate. As we know, in 2016, Congress passed the Federal Assets Sale and Transfer Act, or FASTA. FASTA established a board of outside experts to make recommendations on the sale or redevelopment of federal real estate assets. I want to thank Chairman Denham for his leadership in getting FASTA across the finish line. As part of FASTA, the FRPP was codified into law and made publicly accessible. The intention was not only transparency, but also accountability. It is my hope that as private sector experts, state and local officials, and others review the database, federal agencies will be held accountable for reporting accurate information and identifying properties that can be sold, redeveloped, consolidated, or reused. Unfortunately, it is rare in Washington that agencies meet deadlines. So I appreciate the work of GSA in meeting the deadline for the release of the FRPP in December and the update last month. The release of this database is significant and a win for transparency. Before FASTA was enacted, not even federal agencies had the ability to look across government to identify improvements in space usage. The database includes information for over 300,000 federal real estate assets, including 40,000 office spaces, warehouses, and storage facilities, 17,000 parking structures, and 17,000 leased facilities. To provide a general overview of the breakdown of civilian properties, we have provided 2 slides. The first slide provides an overall breakdown by agency of all its assets. The second slide provides a breakdown of 50,000 assets that include office space, data centers, parking, and warehouse spaces. But while transparency is important, while using the data to inform decisions is critical, in essence, we must turn the data into action. The release of the database provides us an opportunity to crowdsource ideas for how to save taxpayer dollars. Since becoming subcommittee chair, the committee has saved more than $3.6 billion on prospectus-level projects. We can save much more with FASTA, both in the work of the board and the effective use of the FRPP. I hope today we learn how we can ensure that we can capture those savings using the database. Can the data help us identify potential projects like the Volpe Center project in Cambridge, where DOT and GSA were able to take an underutilized 14-acre site and realize a $700 million benefit for the taxpayer? How can federal agencies, the private sector, state and local officials, and the public help us identify these types of projects using the FRPP? Today, I want to discuss 3 critical questions. How can the FRPP be used to improve the management of federal real estate? 2, are the accuracy and the scope of the data collected sufficient for those purposes? And 3, and most importantly, how do we turn that data into action? I want to thank GSA again for its partnership and for meeting the requirements on the FRPP. I also want to thank GAO, who has done a lot of work over the years on the FRPP and federal property. And lastly, I want to thank the private sector representatives who can help us think outside the box and look at property in a way that will create value to the taxpayer. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to recognize the new ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Titus, for any opening remarks that she may have.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this roundtable. I'm delighted to be here and I have a lot to learn. I realize this topic is not very sexy by today's news standards, but it's certainly an important one as we look at how to best use taxpayer dollars in a bipartisan way and in a public-private way. So I'm looking forward to being part of that. You know, the effort to manage our federal real estate goes back to the FASTA, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. I thank Mr. Denham for that, signed by President Obama. And not only did it establish this 6-year pilot program that we're working on to look at how federal property can be sold, consolidated, or redeveloped, and I think that redevelopment part of it is really important. But it also mandated the creation of that publicly accessible database. So that's not only good for us as policymakers, but it's good for the public to be able to see where that property is and how it's being used. I know that that information's just come out in December, and I think it's going to be very helpful as we look towards either freezing or reducing the federal footprint. The current administration has continued these efforts that were started during the previous one, and I think they've made significant progress. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned some of the things that have been reduced over the last 5 years. We've limited new space that agencies can acquire, redeveloped some, sold off some, and just made considerable progress, as I said, in this area. This committee, over that time, though, and the GAO has repeatedly registered serious concerns about the management of our federal real estate. It's been on the high-risk list since 2003, and the GAO has identified the reliability of information in the profile as one of the chief reasons that it remains on that list. So like you, I look forward to hearing how this new database is going to be able to address those reliability issues and move us forward. This dovetails well with the need to reduce the inventory. It allows us to look at our current holdings, look for opportunities for new efficiencies. I think it's going to be highly instrumental in the new Public Buildings Reform Board as they make recommendations reconfiguring, co-locating, and realigning our portfolio of federal real estate. This database will list the acreage, the square footage, the criticality of the building to the agency's mission, its level of utilization, so policymakers and other stakeholders are going to be able to explicitly question the real estate needs and then aggressively pursue public savings, and that's really what it's all about. And then by making that information public, that enhances transparency, so the public with eyes on the ground will be able to offer us some suggestions, and I appreciate the fact that y'all are here to help us do that. If there is a consensus that a piece of property is no longer of use to the federal government, then the public should have an opportunity to weigh in with the board to make suggestions for how it might be disposed of or used in some other way. So I want to encourage the board to make recommendations to us, to be actively involved. Thank all of you for the input that you have, and look forward to hearing more about what we own, where it is, and how it's being used. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Titus. And again, I'd like to thank Mr. Denham for his tireless work on FASTA, and I'd like to recognize him for opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman. Certainly this is a proud moment to get to this point to where we're actually implementing this. But first I want to thank you for your leadership and actually working with us to get this passed and now, more importantly, the implementation phase on getting it right, making sure that we can have full public debate in front of the American people, that we are actually reducing our footprint, that we're combining agencies, that we're making sure that we're justifying the amount of square footage that each agency needs, as well as coordinating between different agencies on, before an agency goes out and tries to buy more property or build more property, they actually look at what we have currently today and whether or not we can combine agencies as well. This is about doing the right thing on behalf of the American public in full daylight and full transparency, and really bringing these projects back to Congress without the politics. You know, let me welcome my good friend Dan Matthews. He and I have spent a lot of time on the road visiting a lot of properties around the country. And, you know, I don't blame any member of Congress. They will all fight for the properties that are in their districts, which is why it's important to make sure that we are doing the best for the American public. And whether it's here in Washington, D.C., the Trump Hotel, making sure that we negotiated a very good property that not only is good utilization of a property, but actually gives back to the Treasury with its profits, or the Georgetown power plant. It wasn't until we scheduled our second hearing there that they actually put a for sale sign up on the property itself. The Cotton Annex. We went to places in California, Florida. You know, we saw some properties that were, because they sat idle, not only were we spending millions of dollars in maintenance and upkeep and security and lights, but we saw buildings that were falling apart. I mean, you leave a building sitting idle in Florida, it gets moldy very, very quick. So some unique opportunities around the entire country. I am proud about not only the work that we've done, but I'm encouraged by the work that this committee and this chairman are going to do in the implementation and making sure that we get this right, we get it effective. We know that we can save about $8 billion in this first tranche, and we want to make sure that we're implementing this as quick as we can for the American public and see this as a very active commission. So thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you. I also want to provide an opportunity for any other members for any opening remarks if they so choose. None being said. So how is this roundtable going to work? First, I'd like to go around the table for quick introductions. So if we may.
I'm Lynn Baez. I'm second vice chair of the International Facility Management Association, and I'm also the vice president of facility operations for Sodexo. Thank you, Congressman Barletta, Denham, and Faso for your leadership in this initiative. I've had the opportunity to work with many of you, not only on FASTA, but now in its implementation phase. I'm really excited to be here. I would really like to spend my time, my focus and energy today talking about the facility management as the practitioner. To Congressman Denham's point in regards to idle buildings, their maintenance, their operation, and how we can best maximize the opportunities that are ahead of us. Really, my perspective here today will be on how we operate the existing portfolio so that we can maximize its future opportunity.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Dan Mears with RSM US. I want to thank the chairman and the committee for your indulgence and inclusion here. My job at the firm is data and analytics governance, and we provide that service for federal and for commercial. So we're looking at the database, we're looking at the history of this and the approach and saying, how can this be leveraged? What other best practices do we know of that can add to the value of this? What are the kind of use cases and that sort of thing? So that this data, to your point, the transparency has to drive out latency, which is clearly what you're doing. And we want to help accelerate that in any way possible. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Peter Van Emberg, and I represent CBRE. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee, for hosting us. We're really honored to be here today. Now, CBRE is the largest commercial real estate firm in the world. We serve owners and occupiers of real estate of all types of assets, from hospitals to life sciences to oil and gas, public sector agencies, state and local, and of course the private sector, on how to really optimize their portfolio needs, from facilities management, transactions, project management. We are tasked with our clients to help derive actionable outcomes, oftentimes savings, from their portfolio. How do we squeeze out that value? Now, traditionally, we're known as a commercial real estate brokerage firm, but really our firm has evolved, much like some of our others here at the table, and we're really a services provider to help our clients achieve their outcomes. And we look to capitalize the market intelligence and the broad scale and reach we have around the world to bring that insight, that knowledge of the data, and make it actionable for our clients. And certainly FASTA is just a well-crafted piece of legislation that does, and it's aimed at doing just that. So how to really make the FRPP data derive actionable insights and strategies for the federal government to achieve taxpayer savings, and that's what the perspective I can share, and I'm here today to share how we do that on behalf of our private sector clients.
Thank you. David Lipson with Savills Studley. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I've been working with the government for more than 20 years, and from the DOT headquarters project, which was the first project which the outside advisors represented the government on, and was also an early project in which we integrated both a need of the government and disposition of excess property. Triggered the sale of the Southeast Federal Center parcel for the DOT headquarters, plus triggered the rest of the Southeast Federal Center sort of development, so that was an early. We were also involved with the Volpe Center project on the other side. So we can talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Hi, my name is Tracy Bibbins. I'm representing JLL. Thank you, Chairman Barletta and the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to discuss saving taxpayer dollars and the federal real property database. We are very familiar with the years of discussions that have led up to the passage of FAFSA of 2016, which coded and expanded the data points in the FRPP, as well as required that the data set be made accessible to the public and to federal agencies. As you may know, JLL is a global professional services firm that specializes in real estate and investment management. Our public institution team has over 400 professionals where we have helped 250 federal, state, and local government and education clients maximize the use of facilities while lowering their operating costs and improving the cash flow. We have extensive experience advising government clients on real property asset repositioning, consolidations, and disposals. I have personally worked with GSA on the national broker contract since 2016, where we've awarded more than 830 leases, and we're currently working on 650 lease procurements. So this puts us in a unique position to provide some feedback today on the FRPP, and we look forward to doing that.
Good morning. My name is Keith Cunningham, and I'm with GAO.
Good morning. My name is Dan Matthews, and thank you, Chairman Barletta, for the opportunity to come back to the committee in this fashion. I just want to thank the committee in general for the bipartisan effort and support of saving taxpayer dollars through real estate. I think we really have a unique opportunity in this administration to have a true partnership between the committee and the administration to do that through making smart real estate decisions. And specifically, Chairman Denham, I want to thank you for that legislation. It really is a unique opportunity. It's never existed before, and we're going to do everything we can to seize that opportunity to save taxpayer dollars. So thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Barletta and members of the committee. My name is Alondra Drain, and I am the Director of the Real Property Policy Division within GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy. My division manages the Real Property Profile database, and so I'm very pleased to be here to participate in today's roundtable to discuss how we can save taxpayers' money and also to discuss how we can utilize best the Federal Property Profile database. Thank you.
Drew Ferguson, Georgia 3. Lloyd Smucker, PA 16.
John Faso, New York 19.
Well, first of all, I'd like to, the purpose of the roundtable is to have a discussion, so I urge you to join in as we move through the topics in like a, free-flowing conversation. I have some questions to help guide us, but I don't want to monopolize the time. Again, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. I want to start off with the potential uses of the FRPP. Mr. Matthews, could you give us a quick update of where GSA is on developing recommendations on sales and redevelopment for the FASTA board, and have the improvements made to the FRPP helped facilitate that process?
Short answer is yes, it is helping. So what we've done at this point, GSA does have a role under the legislation to help assemble recommendations, data and ideas basically for the board when it's established. So we have done 2 data calls so far across the government to request feedback from specific agencies. So again, we've had these 2 data calls. The information's come in. We're reviewing those internally for ideas, and we're also supplementing the data that and suggestions we've received from agencies with our own ideas. So we're looking across the inventory, not just our own GSA inventory, and looking for opportunities for recommendations to hand over to the board, so when they arrive, they're not starting from scratch. They've got something of substance to take and move on. The other thing I'd like to mention is we have a contract that we have out on the street right now for private sector commercial real estate support for GSA to help go through these ideas, recommendations, suggestions we're getting from agencies and the FRPP database to take a second look at it, to also come up with additional potential recommendations for the board, so that when the board is in place, we're able to hand that over to the board and they can hit the ground running. So that's the quick summary of what we've done so far. While we can't talk about the specifics of the lists that we have, the first round, has a requirement, a minimum requirement of $500 million of market value. That the recommendation should reflect that, with a maximum of $750 million. And we believe we are getting close to that range. So for this first round, we think we're in a fairly decent place at this stage of the game.
Good. And again, anyone feel free to jump in at any time with any follow-up or anything else that anyone has to add. One of the use of the FRPP is identifying properties for sale. Can the rest of you talk about how the FRPP could be effectively used to identify high-value assets for sale?
So I know part of the discussion here today is about what additional information would be helpful to us. And the information that's available publicly is somewhat limited. But I'll say that when we got the list and the database, and we went through it, and we identified high-value markets to start. And we then pulled all properties in the high-value markets, period. And some of them, obviously, nothing's going to happen to. Foley Square Courthouse in New York is not going anywhere. But we pulled all of the lists, and we had sorted it all within about 3 days, sent it out to our offices, and within about 5 days after that, we had identified multiple opportunities in each of the markets. So I think identifying the high-value opportunities, even with the initial information that's publicly available in the list, is not an issue. I mean, a couple things you can't identify. You can identify. What we looked for with the information are opportunities, the easy opportunities, to the extent where we thought there was a way to achieve value without disrupting the federal occupancy. Volpe is an example. Obviously, another example is where you have some excess land, you have air rights, you have whatever. I mean, but without, because we don't know what's inside the building, so that's what's missing. What you can identify right now are the high-value targets where you're not disturbing occupancy, but we don't know what's inside the building. We don't know if the building has 8 people in it, 8,000 people in it, 8,000 people, but it doesn't work for those 8,000 people, et cetera. There aren't that many opportunities in the portfolio where it's so obvious that a fully leased building could be sold and the people relocated and save money. I mean, those don't exist. You have to have an immense amount of value and multiples of be able to build multiples of density to what you have there, and it just doesn't exist very much. So it's pretty easy to identify the opportunities. I think it's the resources, I think, are best spent on getting to the sort of the next step in terms of, and the legislation includes that, I know, in terms of, okay, how do we take advantage of these opportunities right now? And from our perspective, we don't know what to do with them yet. So we've identified opportunities. We think there's value in it for us as a sort of private sector provider, but what do we do next? And it would be helpful to sort of have a path.
You mentioned the Volpe Center. Is the data presented in a way that will help us identify other potential projects, or like the Volpe Center? If not, what other data would be needed that would be helpful to identify? It
is. I mean, if you give a real estate firm the location, we can figure out how big the building is, how big the size is. We don't need anything else to figure out the outside. So you could figure out Volpe from the information. There aren't a ton of Volpes out there. I mean, Volpe, was a unique circumstance in one of the highest value submarkets in the United States. So there aren't too many like that. What we can't figure out from the data is if a building's half full or not, or is full, but everyone's sitting in 2,000 square feet per person. So that's what's missing. But the Volpe-like opportunities where there's a whole bunch of extra density there, those we can figure out, and that's what we've done, where we think there's extra value from excess land, from air rights, from a tiny build, in general, all of those opportunities.
I'd like to echo to that point. I believe if data points were considered on the maintenance of the facility, on the internal, on the asset composition, what was included, it would not only help the capital outlay that would needed for a one-time investment to see if it is a high-value opportunity, but also the operational maintenance required. So when we're looking at the dollars per square foot for total cost of ownership or life cycle cost analysis, those data points would be very helpful to give to a group like CBRE the opportunity to really give a full view of what the potential sale or redistribution of that property to be.
And just to echo my colleagues here on the table, utilization is so critical. And I know GSA has spent a lot of effort on, based on personal experience working with them, on working and educating these agencies on how to track, identify, and capture the utilization data. I think with a fully transparent tool like FRPP, by able to capture the utilization details, you're able to really extract not just what you can do with that individual site like a Volpe, but also across the portfolio looking for co-location opportunities where you can bring agencies together to maximize the value of the space they're occupying. Additionally, you can pull them out of lease space they're already occupying and consolidate into, say, some of the many GSA-owned buildings throughout the portfolio. But absent the utilization data, it's just impossible to look from the outside in to make those determinations.
Yes, also echoing that the utilization is extremely important for not only the disposition, but as just mentioned, the consolidations. And further also, if we were able to get to find out the information about the like building IDs to get a better understanding of the relationships between the large campus and the parcels, that information would also be helpful as we look for opportunities for cost savings.
If I may, I would dovetail on that. I think the way the unique IDs are structured today is useful for the intended purpose, but there's a broader purpose. So relating a project, a property to multiple tax parcels and being able to understand that. Second, that would get us to not only the current utilization, but the potential and approved or acceptable uses of the property and the ability to compare the use of the property, as we understand it, to what's being done contiguous to that property. That's all going to be indicative, particularly as you go down market. So we've heard about the high-value markets, and that's clearly where you need to start, and you're going to get momentum. But there's no reason we can't be operating across tranches or across layers of the portfolio, and shouldn't be. And clearly, we're going to need more visibility there to support the kind of consolidation opportunities we're hearing about. So the knowledge about the tax lot parcels, if you will, other kind of courthouse information. Now, not all of this we're suggesting should be the burden of the government. There is a potential based on how this data is structured and presented to connect easily to commercial and public information to help get that. And I think our property management leaders here are clearly adept at doing that. We would like to make it as easy as possible for as broad a community of potential interest to do that. And there are some ways to do that. We'll prepare separate notes for you, of course, but we would suggest that when you think about this, the maintenance issue is the other issue. And we're talking about just the granularity of the data. The data's there, and I should step back. I think GSA should be congratulated. We did analysis of the 2013 data structure and instruction in the 2017. And the act and the growth of the maturity of data management and the level of detail, the instructions and the rules are going to drive some significant benefits to us all. As we do that, we can continue to look at the kinds of issues that this roundtable is suggesting. And I think if you look at maintenance, the old adage is if you're not doing something to a property, it's running away from you. And so what are we doing periodically that would allow us to both project what the ongoing operating costs are based on the age of the property and the likely use, and what has been done most recently, let's say going back a few quarters on properties that are lightly used. These sorts of things are definitely within the grasp of the program now.
And to that point, simple categorization of predictive, preventative, or reactive maintenance as categorizations that are general, familiar terms, IFMA, BOMA, other counterparts of ours from an industry perspective. These are common terms that the GSA and other entities are very familiar with that can be able to utilize that as a categorization matrix to include as data points when we're looking at the opportunity ahead of us. So to echo your point, I think it's really clear general language that could be utilized in some of the data sorting opportunities.
So as you hear all of this, the other thing we would just recommend is that you consider this a tremendous asset as I'm sure you do. We're all invested in this, right? So let's protect that. I would suggest that there's a little bit of glamour in this topic, not so much as maybe what's going on here, but there's one statistic I would share from maybe across the hall. There's a gentleman with a firm with some data issues who has said he's going to hire 20,000 people to go through that data and to essentially impose rules on it after having collected it. This is the single most expensive way, and I speak to this as somebody who has cleaned data and structured data and supported various uses for 25 years. The best practice, and GSA has real demonstrated strength here, is to understand the rules you want to impose over the data before you allow it in, and to control the quality of it. So as we talk about additional data that would be valuable to this, either in the database or easily connected to the database from public and commercial sources, let's also continue to articulate the rules we expect to be followed, particularly for the data we ingest. And let's maintain a chain of custody visibility to who provided it, when they provided, and when it changed. This is just data hygiene. It's very technical, and I apologize if I'm too much in the weeds. But managing this asset has some similarities to managing a real property. And so really having rules about how you use it, what you allow to occur there, and how you maintain it will make a sustainable difference in your ability to continue to drive results from this financially.
To Mr. Mears' point, I would also add that using common language is a key factor. I would say when part of IFMA's engagement through FASTA engagement through overall and now through its implementation was the development and training of our practitioners in using common language and terms in how they're categorizing the facilities that they operate, how they utilize the facilities that they operate. I believe that continuous training in those categories really will help facilitate a clean data set point that he's referencing as we continue to look forward in how we repurpose facilities when we're doing those transitions and handovers. All of that common language and familiarity will be key to ensure that we have a very clean data point as we proceed.
Yeah, and Mr. Mears, just for the record, today is a very slow news day around here. I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Titus.
Thank you. I didn't mean to start something when I said well, I hear you say we need to be sure that this data is readily available to a broad community, not just to the experts who are sitting here. I would ask you from the GSA, once we get all this data, how are you going to reach out so we're sure that everybody does have access to it and can take advantage of it, not just a handful of selected developers?
Yeah, I'd like to talk just a little bit about how the FRPP has evolved. It started we did our first data collection in 2005. And so now with the passage of FASTA, we have a tremendous opportunity to make some improvements and make that transition from a inventory database to something that people can use, agencies, private sector, can use for better asset management. And we've seen that FASTA has impacted FRPP in two major ways, some of which have already been mentioned. For instance, it's improved transparency by making the data publicly accessible. We think that the greater transparency and visibility of the data will encourage agencies to improve the quality of the information that they're reporting. Likewise, it has also expanded the data that is available. So we've increased the number of agencies that are reporting data from 18 up to over 50. It's also added some additional data elements that were not previously collected that should be helpful. For instance, we're now collecting information about the number of personnel that are in facilities. We're also collecting information about capital expenditures, as well as information about the length of time that agencies are in a status of excess, surplus, or underutilized. So that's all very good information that we think can be effectively utilized by the private sector and other agencies to identify opportunities. Some of the ways that we have used the data internally for government to help agencies look for opportunities for disposal, for co-locations, for consolidation, is we've used it to gauge the effectiveness of some of our policies and see how agencies are performing in terms of their portfolios. For instance, with the reduced footprint policy, with the freeze of footprint policy and the national strategy, the FRPP data tells us how agencies are performing in terms of reaching their reduction targets. We've also used it to develop some, made it central to some analytical tools that we've developed for agencies to use. For instance, we've developed a tool that was launched actually both were launched in 2016, known as the Asset Consolidation Tool, which allows other agencies to see the assets of other agencies and identify other federal space that's within a certain geographic radius of their own, that presents an opportunity for them to look for opportunities to consolidate or to co-locate. There's another tool that we've also developed called the Real Property Management Tool, and that tool provides a lot of different analyses, which includes looking at the utilization of space. It also identifies agencies' opportunities to achieve greater efficiencies, like cost avoidance, if they were to dispose of assets that they've identified as underutilized or excess. And it provides other information that they can use. And our sense is that, and from the feedback that we've received from agencies, that they are using these tools to develop their strategic plans as they're looking at their opportunities to reduce their portfolios. I think the challenge that we have is that there is a difference in the data that agencies have available to them and the data that is available to the public, and we'll have to figure out how to gauge that. But I do want to share that we are actively engaging with agencies in developing some tools that we think that they can find very helpful as they look at their portfolios for opportunities.
I appreciate that. That's a good description of the data and how the agencies are using it. My question was, how do you get that information out to the public so that we can have more participation and not just a select few? Maybe you could help me with that, Mr. Matthews.
So in terms of the wide public, of course, the public release of it, that it is physically available. How do we encourage people to sort of do a crowdsourcing approach? Quite frankly, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. If on a macro level, if agencies find this useful, I think they will use it more. The accuracy, the data will improve more. And if people are providing that sort of input into it, and agencies are actually acting on it, that probably creates an incentive for more engagement. For specialized public entities like real estate companies and whatnot, there are a couple different levels where they can be employed. One, if they're on their own looking for ideas, but also the government. So Congress, when it appropriated the $5 million just recently for the FAST board, I was really critical because that provides enough money for the board actually to hire on its own outside commercial real estate support to help develop the recommendations.
Nobody's been appointed to that board yet. Do y'all have any suggestions of what kind of people would be good to have on there that could help to get this information out?
I want to just touch on, in terms of sort of the information, the status of the information, and sort of how useful it is to the sort of the wider public. Nothing that we have done with the data was with any sort of proprietary database or anything we paid for. Literally, we sorted data, used Google Earth, and literally used Google Earth and said, oh, there's extra land around there. And then if we thought there was an opportunity, we went to the sort of whatever the municipality was, the zoning maps, and found the zoning, and just all publicly available research based on the address. And generally, if it's sort of wider distribution, people are going to be interested in stuff near them. And it's all sortable that way. So I think there's nothing we did that was, that cost any money or that was sort of unique to our skill set. So it really is available.
I will say, I agree with a lot of those points, and that's certainly a way you could determine the market value and the valuation of certain properties or the attractiveness of some of the assets. But even just going through some of the data as well, when 96% of the 303,000 assets are deemed mission need or mission critical, that informs the public or conveys to the public that hands off. This is needed for these agency input. That's a really, really high number from a private sector viewpoint, as well as the utilization graph that was in one of the materials. Nearly zero was deemed underutilized. I mean, in the private sector, the clients I deal with, nearly 50% of the portfolio is underutilized in some capacity. So those sort of, yes, you could look at some of the available market points to see, yes, World Trade Center is a very beautiful, valuable asset, but what can you really do with it if the agency is saying it's mission critical and it is fully utilized? Adds to some really challenges on how the public really view the marketability of the asset. And furthermore, to answer directly your question, Representative Titus, is around how can you get this out to the public? There's a lot of really inexpensive ways to make a database more easily digestible to a public view. There's been some of our clients we worked with on federal agencies like Postal Service or state and local agencies where we've created, microsite or websites where it's just translate data into a searchable function. It could be Tableau or Google Earth, and it just allows maybe in a more public-facing, less data nerd way to search through the data to look or, hey, what's in my backyard? Where are some of the assets available? So I think that is an important consideration as you think about how to make it more public-facing. There's a lot of inexpensive ways to do that. And then thinking about what's the mechanism for receiving input back from the public. Does it go to GSA? Does it go to FASTA, the board? Does it go to their local congressman? I think that just needs to be perhaps a little more clear, and that will probably come with future iterations of legislation.
I think those are exceptionally good insights. And I would, just to respond to your question directly, as you think about a board and you think about these roundtables, one of the strengths of what you've done so far as a committee, and the chairman has done, is to pull people together who clearly represent different audiences for this data, different potential users. I would get more specific about thinking about who our audience is, who the potential users of these properties, who are the channels, the brokers and others who can get us to them. I think in addition to the technical approaches that can be made to expose the data more broadly, why aren't we thinking about the real estate investment community and looking at the sites they already use? Syndicating government data is a well-known function. And so if we were to put this out, and I'll mention some without advertising, they are not clients that have an interest, but if you look at a Zillow or this sort of thing, that's one way to think about it. They typically want to see MLS and they're more retail. But they're moving clearly to multifamily and commercial properties, and there are a number of public sites that people know about and use that would go to. So if you had a commercial variant of that, and you syndicated a subset of the data around the use type, you'd start to get the data in a more public forum, rather than having a direct channel that you need to go to only. But the key is how do we expose it? And if these roundtables and the formal panel that you create includes representation or a knowledge of the different communities, audiences that will use this, then I think you have something.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Representative Plaskett.
Thanks. I have one question. This is really very informative to me, and I'm new to the committee, so this is really bringing me up to speed. But I wanted to, it seems like this has been a really great board, and it has done work that provides valuable, useful information for the near future. What do you think are the long-term benefits of the board, and it's the use that we can then pivot it to something that is strategically valuable for all of us 20 years from now?
I would just say it very simply. If we think about the sustained mission and value of the board, the ability to not only deal with the current set of conditions and inventory, but to establish, set, and to start to model behaviors around the way the government goes after, acquires, commits itself to, and uses property over time. Think about this consolidation function. You're really driving us to better behaviors around the level of real utilization of properties. And that can be all kinds of consolidation models that you know well. Why doesn't that become a standard in the front part of the acquisition and commission, committal process to properties? I think you're establishing new standards in the way that we think about using real estate and related assets.
I think it's also a tool that's probably more immediately being used to show us which agencies best fit with each other, and bringing down duplication of services as well, or which can facilitate each other and assist Americans in getting through the morass at times of federal government.
Can I have it here? Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. We did a study a couple years ago that touched on just that issue. We looked at agencies who were leasing land in certain major markets. And in those markets, was there excess land already owned by the federal government? And what we found, we looked at two different markets, San Antonio, Texas, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and there was enough excess land in each of those markets to fill not just the leases they were looking for, but every federal lease in that area. And the problem was the agencies didn't know who their neighbors were. And so when they went looking, they're required to look and see if there's federal property available, but they didn't have a place to look, and that was before the database was made public. So I think that this is an important step for that side of sustainability.
And if I could just add to that, So the legislation required some additional data fields that didn't exist before. And you'll recall just the challenges that, when I used to be with the committee, that we had trying to figure out how many people were actually in a facility. There was no place one could go to find that out. GSA didn't even know that. GSA finds out how many people are in a building when we have a project to replace the facility. If we have a lease, we get a housing plan from the agency. If we're doing a restacking of the building, we'll then find out how many people are in it. Otherwise, before this, we had no idea. We get a rent check every month from an agency, and if we got a rent check, it was fully occupied. But we had no idea how many people were actually in it. And so there are just 3 fields that were added by the law alone that are, I can't really overstate the importance of that information for basic portfolio management. The number of people in the building, both federal employees and contractors, that's a requirement now, so agencies are reporting that data. Historical capital expenditures and estimated future capital expenditures with an operating cost. Without those things, you can't make the most fundamental portfolio management decisions as to whether or not you should hold a property, whether or not you should reinvest in a property or dispose of a property. And until this information started to be collected, we had it within GSA, or some of it. We didn't have the head counts. But for government-wide, there was no place where one could go to have that basic information. So I think long-term, this has a tremendous potential to allow for much better portfolio management and cost savings.
Before I recognize Mr. Ferguson, Dan, I just want to jog your memory when you were on the committee, when we were trying to talk agencies into lowering their utilization rate. Remember, a very difficult time doing that. When we were in Atlanta, maybe I'm not remembering correctly, didn't the IRS and Social Security find that they were compatible in consolidating in the same building because they sort of had like walk-in folks, and it actually made for a good utilization for those 2 agencies to share a building? Am I thinking of that?
You all remember that, right? It was IRS and Social Security. They're both public-facing. Oftentimes, they're in similar locations. And I think a little progress has been made, but probably not near so much as one would hope. But we also find, even to this day, again, we check. We're required to check, and we do. But agencies oftentimes are in the mindset when they've got a requirement, they just want to replace this requirement. And oftentimes they don't even think large enough within their own portfolio to look for co-location opportunities just within an agency, let alone multiple agencies. So that's a culture change. But now that we're starting to create the data and easy access to that information, where they can have those considerations. In our regions, we do that. Mr. Drain was mentioning how we have a tool now. It's a GIS-based tool for our own inventory, where literally you can click on a point of a map and you will see all of our GSA properties that come up around it and who's in it, and things, how big it is, things like that. So we see those opportunities up front to make those kind of portfolio decisions. Because if you don't have access to that, there's a lot of work to get done to replace occupancy agreements, expiring leases, and it's enough of a challenge to get those done anywhere close to on time as it is. And so if it's not simple, it won't happen. And so that's why I say this really has, I think, a huge potential as the data gets better, as agencies become more familiar with it, and as we develop tools to utilize it and access it more simply. I think there's a tremendous potential.
Chairman, I would like to echo to your example. Oh, thank you. Intended use is key there, right? To your example, both of those entities had a direct interface with the public in the way that their facility was going to be designed. And when you think about classification as part of categorization options within the tool, intended use is key. The operators of these facilities, the designers, the engineers, the FMs that run the site, they really know what the new and for a future state, how the intent of the facility will be run in the future. If we're going to go to maybe virtual kiosk options, for example, when we're interfacing with certain segments of the American public, how will we then transfer those intended uses through information such as this? Because if you're going to do an extensive capital investment to reconfigure a space that maybe might be in the right site at the right zip code, but there could be another facility that has the exact same internal infrastructure that could be a much easier implementation opportunity. I think when we talk about common language, common understanding of what the facilities are in place today through that categorization options, what's in the tool, and expand on really what their intent is for the future. I think to your point of how do we look at long-term application of the information, it's really looking at how we have, from an operator's perspective, going to use the site and can use the site in the future. So I think that there's some opportunity there for us.
So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to answer your question directly also, it reminds me of some of the great work that I had the pleasure of working with GSA on several years ago with their Office of Real Property Management. That was their client portfolio planning program that was aligned to the Reduce the Footprint, Freeze Footprint initiative. I bring that up because armed with the right level of data, cross-agency data, it really empowered GSA to work with the agencies on making smarter real property decisions. Some of the actionable strategies that came out of that was working with FEMA, which was a very willing agency, to think about, why do we have 8 leases in Washington, D.C.? Let's get smarter and consolidate into headquarters. And with Norm Dong's leadership on that and GSA, they were able to effect and make that happen. That led to the development of the Consolidation Fund and other mechanisms to, as we all know around this table, oftentimes takes money to save money. One of the opportunities that came up that was kind of eye-opening was even looking at across warehousing space. So we looked at one agency that has various components in the D.C. area, all along Montgomery County in Maryland, and they had warehouses across the street from each other that were sitting nearly vacant or underutilized, but one is associated with one component, another was with another component, but there's just not that opportunity for these agencies to sometimes pull up and look at, is there something smarter we can be doing with not just our office assets, but some of our other more specialized assets. It was a terrific program.
Yeah. I was just going to add on to the Atlanta Roundtable comment, as being there in Atlanta and understanding that those two agencies would have never probably had that conversation if they weren't in the Roundtable, at that time. So I think this data set will certainly help facilitate the conversations with the federal clients to ask about consolidations or opportunities to create better space utilization. And then as far as long-term, I do believe that over time, this data set is going to evolve depending on the government's needs and the technology solutions. And lastly, the government isn't experiencing these pain points alone. Our Fortune 500 clients have the same experience with portfolio management and technology solutions, and we are, able to strategize with them to come up with as mentioned today, there are many different technology solutions out there to get this data set accurate as possible for the long-term solutions to be achieved.
I think what I'm hearing is that the committee has to take our show on the road again. Mr. Ferguson?
Thanks, Chairman. In this, can you, and Ms. Matthews, I'll start with you. Can you kind of break down in this report or give me an idea of how much of this are buildings and what of it is land? Or do you have a pretty good handle on that?
Well, I think what you're looking at there are two of those graphs. One of them are facilities, and the other is everything. And you see a big difference in the numbers, like 300,000 versus somewhere around 50,000.
Yep.
The difference are structures. So roads, bridges, docks, boat landings, irrigation facilities, all sorts of things, radio towers, you name it. All of that is in there, and that's the large 309,000 square foot sites, or 309,000 sites. When you get down to facilities, and that list, it defines it at the top, what they mean by that. And these are just civilian agencies, so DOD-controlled facilities are not on this list, right? Data centers, offices, parking structures, storage facilities, and warehouses. So kind of what we would probably think of as a more typical building thing. That's what the 49,000 is. And we had GSA, we've got the second highest number of those. And for us, it's mostly office buildings and warehouses. But we also have labs, border stations. We've got a lot of unique things as well, but it's mostly office buildings and warehouses.
Once you organize it by square footage, you can slice this a million different ways. I have one chart here that shows by square footage instead of the numbers, and GSA bounces right to the top because their facilities are really large and Department of Interior's are mostly pretty small.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's just trying to get my mind wrapped around where the land component of this is, and I think one of the interesting things for me about this, you know, I understand we're looking at it about how to make agencies more efficiency, you know, how to make sure that we're, you know, using tax dollars wisely with facility management, and I see that we're on the right track with this. But there's a component of how do you partner, or this is my perspective, how do you partner with, say, a local community that's got a federal asset there that would like to see to use that federal asset as a starting point for an economic development project, okay? For example, land around a Corps of Engineer lake that is laying idle. How could you use that federal asset in partnership with the state and local development authority to then begin to create additional economic activity? So that's how I look at it is when we talk about the disposition of the property. What's, you know, how do local communities make the most of those opportunities on there? So I just make that as a comment, no question on it.
You know, I would just very briefly respond to that. I think that's a great question, and I think it brings us back to who are the audiences. So if we talk about regional planning commissions and other bodies that are going to get us connected in a way, and those folks are always looking at how land is being used, planned, committed, funded. This all goes through a variety of local and state and related levels. If we were to start to think about, and I think you've got people assembled here who could do this, listing out a simple outline of what are some of those structures at different levels, right? Moving towards a, you know, in data terms, a taxonomy, but a way to know who those constituencies are, and then understand how to communicate this data availability and how to provide additional support as been suggested using simple visualizations. Because while members here have talked about using the public data and doing very quick analysis, I would posit that they're pretty sharp folks who do this a lot. Some of the constituents we want to deal with are not going to be as well versed in doing it, some will. So let's make sure that we get the data and some services wrapped around it so that they could do this. And let's identify who they are to get that visibility you suggested. I think there's a lot of strength in that.
Is there any discussion about, we talk about a lot about intended use of facilities. You know, one of the answers that I would get when I was mayor was, well, that's not what it was intended for. Sure. Well, you know, that the thing was built 25 years ago or 30 years ago, and our community has changed and developed. Will there be recommendations, or where do you think those recommendations should come about changing the intended use? But I go back to the Corps of Engineers. I'm not trying to beat up on the Corps, but, you know, the answer is, well, that's not the intended use. Well, we get that, but that's not really in the best interest of the community right now. So how do you, where do you recommend that?
At the risk, you know, as a data geek, I'm not good at simplifying, but the risk of oversimplifying, I think you catch your kids being good. I think the other thing we've talked about today, but we haven't talked about how to capture, is that there are current and emerging success stories. And some of those are going to show that we have deviated from, we have transitioned away from originally intended use. And we've come up with something that's viable and sustainable that may be somewhat innovative, somewhat different. I don't think 25 years ago we were planning for data centers quite the way we are today, and I don't think we were putting infrastructure in to support those. And I think we're starting to rethink infrastructure and roads and bridges and things related to the way our cars drive themselves and so forth. So I would suggest that let's capture successes that have occurred or emerging and are appropriate to expose, along with the inventory. Let's highlight the ability of federal and other levels of agencies as well as private to work together to innovate on those in a way that's viable. So it may not be originally intended, but it's viable with regard to regional plans, to zoning and other usage development plans. It's sustainable over some life cycle, because I think this 20-year challenge is a great challenge. And not only are you setting patterns through this work for the way we plan and commit to using property going forward, but we're probably at a point where some of these more advanced high-value and mid-value market opportunities are going to need to be creative, probably come with a kind of 15 or 20-year planning cycle for that investment. Our investors required, our managers, our occupants required. So you're really starting to project 15, 20-year use cycles here. All of that is within your realm, I think.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think due to the decentralized nature of the data collection coming in, I think there's an opportunity to really continue to empower and embrace a role where GSA is able to help challenge some of the data they're getting from these agencies. So to your point, challenge the intended use of some of these agencies, or really push on these agencies to justify why is this deemed mission critical or mission need. I mean, it's kind of like when I ask my kids who are really young to go down and find some toys to donate to, the public, they'll come up with 2. But if I go down, I come up with bags of toys just to toss.
I've done that before. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So I think continuing to have that, collaboration and really the empowerment of GSA and the work they do with the agencies to really help question and validate how the intended use of some of these assets.
Should we be more intentional in Congress about requiring a review of intended use of properties?
So if I could.
And with that, when we do new projects and we have new capital outlays, should we make that a requirement of those new of those new outlays, that every so often the intended use of that property must be reevaluated? Should we be writing that into the legislation and be very intentional about that?
I think to answer that, I think your example of the lake was a very interesting one, because the lake may be fully utilized, but the land around it is not. Who's to make the decision whether you need 10 feet of shorefront, you need half the shorefront, you need all the shorefront, you need access to the lake, but what do you need? So you could have the best data set, and it would be fair in that case for the Corps to say the lake's fully utilized. It is. But, it's sort of one parcel. They own 100 acres, 80 acres is underwater, 20 acres, I'm making it up. But, so that's a really interesting one, because it's, the data, you got to get past the data, and that kind of, I'm going to say something a little heretic, a little heresy, but, I mean, I think to a certain extent, I get nervous about this discussion, because the focus on the data, it gets to be sort of self-filling. It's about the data itself. It's not about the data. It's about figuring out how do we use space more efficiently. And there's clearly data that we don't have yet, and we touched on it initially, is the occupancy and the utilization of it. That's like the most important thing that's missing there. But we need the funding is absolutely critical. There are very few assets that you're going to be able to dispose of where the funding will pay necessarily, where it'll be very clear, like Volpe, where the disposition value paid for making government more efficient, paid to build the building. And very, very few. So we talk about like consolidating 2 agencies in 2 buildings so you can sell one of the buildings. Who's paying to consolidate that agency? The mechanism for it. There's pilot programs, there's things out there, but the agencies have no money to start the planning. And, that's the critical thing. I mean, they have no money to save money. And we see this is not just in this. I mean, we've had multiple examples under the national broker contract where tenants stay put in 30% more space because they have no money to save money.
Well, I mean, could you create a revolving loan fund that after consolidation, the sale of the asset pays the revolving loan fund back?
Yeah, I mean, that would be awesome. I mean, take the money and keep it, hold it, and instead of sort of distributing it out. And that gets to, my other point, we're implementers. I'm not a data guy, but You know, one of the things is that's why you go after some of the high-value targets where you're not disturbing the occupancy early, to build up some of the resources, to show the success stories, so that, you know, agencies will look at the other agency who saved $50 million a year in ongoing operating expense by doing this, and it really didn't hurt their people. The other thing, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but every agency has its own standards, space standards. You talk about consolidating. There needs to be some standardization out there somewhere, and with GSA or another entity given sort of control, more control of it, you know, because without standardization, you're going to have minimal ability to consolidate. And, you know, across agencies, you're going to have continued balkanization. So, I mean, sort of long term, you need the funding source, you need more one government, and you need sort of more sort of one source of control to be able to enforce a little bit. And I think in terms of understanding that, you know, your example with the lake, I mean, that's the local market that needs to determine there's value on that shoreline, and then how does that local community, whether that's the community, whether that's an individual, whether that's a company, sort of get to where do they go? Where do they go to sort of get an answer? Because if you go into the morass of the court, yeah, you'll never get an answer. Everyone knows that. I mean, but where is that? In that circumstance where it is, I mean, that's to sort of break it apart. That is a utilized property, but it's not.
For the funding point, isn't there a federal building fund that already exists that you could use for that purpose if it were funded adequately?
That's a Dan question, for sure.
Yes, so there is a federal buildings fund that is there for GSA-controlled properties. So we can't spend federal building fund money on, say, a DOD-owned facility. We can spend it on a GSA-controlled facility. The last several years, it's been challenging in an appropriations environment to the way the fund works. Agencies pay rent, so we have a certain amount of rent coming in, about $10 billion every year. In the last few years, we haven't been able to access all $10 billion. It's closer to somewhere between $8 and $9 billion a year. Historically, frankly, it was the other way around. Historically, Congress would supplement the fund, but in recent years, it hasn't been the case. So that is a challenge to access the funds. But to the basic question of it takes money to oftentimes to relocate somebody off a piece of property, and can GSA be helpful there? There are some situations right now, for example, GSA, where we have properties. We've owned them for a very long time. The requirement was much larger at a previous point in time. The buildings are beyond their useful life. The acreage is much larger than what we actually need. And as an asset management decision, it doesn't make sense to really reinvest into that property because of the condition of the facilities. And in the outside market, frankly, it makes sense to move off of that property.
Turn it into a hotel, maybe?
And then dispose of the property. And so we have funds that we can use to relocate people in those situations. And the decision's really based on sort of a real estate asset decision of, is that particular property worth holding and worth investing in or not, or can we meet this requirement more cost effectively somewhere else? And so we're making that decision in some cases where we're moving people off, and the consequence of that is, you know, we've got 90 acres now, and that can be sold. So to David's example, those sale proceeds won't cover all of those costs and the relocation costs, and the timing doesn't quite work out. But we're moving anyways. We're spending money to do that. But now we have something that's actually quite valuable to sell. And so then we can go forward with a disposal. And so that's a situation where it's kind of a combination of the FASTA law can be very useful as a disposal tool, but the decision to actually get off of the property and some of the money that will be used to get us off of that property is coming out of the Federal Buildings Fund.
So can I ask one more, do you mind? So it sounds like that it would be, we need to be more intentional about how we're going to move agencies from one building to the other. And I think the reality is that you know, I don't get a sense that anybody in Congress is really willing to spend a whole lot more money to do that. So, but if we could isolate that revenue stream for the sale of buildings, or at least get, a corpus of money I call it a revolving loan fund. I don't know what it would be, but create enough sustainability in that program, and then the sale of the asset would go back into that fund to ensure that that process could continue until we got the inventory where we wanted it.
It's a great idea, and Chairman Denham actually put that into his bill.
Oh,
So there actually is a fund. So under the FASTA law, when a property is disposed of, the proceeds will go into that fund. It is subject to appropriation, though, but the purpose of that fund is just what you described, to finance the next round of recommendations, whether it's a consolidation or relocating somebody off of some other piece of property so that can be sold.
I also believe some of the funds are also used for not only the one-time outlay for the transition of the property, but also the training of the individuals that would now operate it in its new intent. So to your earlier question of intended use, and when people say, oh, we can't use it, it's in a different, it was originally intended for X versus Y, much of the understanding of the internal infrastructure of that particular property is key, and then also the transition of that commissioning and recommissioning of that space is also a key driver, I believe, also in the bill, is that they would have training on both ends when you turn it over, and then when you're going to use it for something new, they can completely understand the full infrastructure of what that site represents and how it can be converted to that new intended use. So.
Mr. Matthews, now that the database is public, ideas could in a way be crowdsourced. There are real estate experts, state and local officials, and others who may be able to identify opportunities that the federal agencies have not identified. Have you considered pulling together a Tiger team of your top GSA real estate professionals who could receive, evaluate, and where appropriate, pursue proposals that make sense?
So what we've done is we have an office of, what's it called, Real Property Utilization and Disposal. It's about 80 people that work on property disposal. You're familiar with them up in Pittsburgh. That is providing the support for our FASTA responsibilities. And we're also, like I mentioned earlier, we have a contract out on the street right now that we hope to award sometime soon to bring in commercial real estate support that can help do what you're describing, so that we have government people focusing on this, but also some specialized experts who've got a lot of market-based knowledge, like Mr. Lipson was describing, so they can come up with ideas that, that frankly we're not going to find on our own, and they can go through those databases. So those are the two things that are in place right now. And then once the board is established, we would be providing some support to the board as well. And effectively, yes, we've got like a team of people in GSA that it's in their performance reviews that making the FASTA board successful is the key to them being successful as well.
Chairman, could I hop in here? I think it's really important what Dan said in terms of having people to respond to these. The first step was making the data available. What we expect to happen now is a lot of ideas, creative ideas coming from the private sector about how to use government property that might not be fully utilized. But that could all grind to a halt if the government then just lets those ideas sit there and no one is there to think about them and respond. So I want to really hold Dan's feet to the fire on that. There's a request from your subcommittee that'll help us do that this year.
Yeah, I think this brings us to the third purpose that we talked about at the beginning of the roundtable. Are there other ideas, and this is to the group, are there other ideas on how we can turn the data into action? That's the most important, I think, part of this whole deal of having the data. So if so, what are they and how would they work?
Well, I can speak from CBRE experience on how we've worked with other public sector agencies, state and local, and like a lot of my colleagues here, we've invested as a firm hundreds of millions of dollars into these technology-enabling solutions that allow us to do things incredibly efficiently, where you can take an entire portfolio, dump it into a technology solution to do immediate mark-to-market market intelligence where it will take, the lease rate, the owned rate per square foot against what is commonly in the market database worldwide. Or you can do that from a space utilization standpoint. And I think in terms of how we look at from a private sector to respond to our clients to ask us, here's my data, now do something with it. That is really the intent of our investment in technology enablement and innovation tools to really translate that data into real actionable strategies that can then be quickly modeled into different scenarios and compelled into good return on savings. So.
Yeah, and I echo that. It's really to provide greater leverage into the market. So, for instance, if the data set shows there are multiple leases in one building, then we could leverage that when we're negotiating, for the agencies. Also, and again, because the agencies now have the transparency into the data, it can increase or better our conversations with the agencies on consolidation opportunities. So I think both of those are ways that we could turn this into actionable savings.
I'd take a slightly sort of smaller approach, is that need some more wins. And while we're working on all of this, identify a couple of opportunities. As I said, we just going through the data, identified probably 25 very significant ones that wouldn't disrupt tenant agencies. And pick a couple and figure out how to get them through as efficiently as possible. And that'll tell GSA a lot and tell the committee a lot. And again, success breeds success. There's been a lot of mileage gotten out of Volpe, as should be, but where's the next one? And while you're working on the big picture, work on a couple of successes that are out there. And I have a fear that we're sort of keep looking at the data and the big picture and not taking opportunities to save money, because that's as important. And I think the committee can really help GSA sort of clear out some difficulties in implementation. And you don't necessarily know what those difficulties are we'll kind of know generally, but until you do them, until you run a couple and see what the traps are.
If I could just add, I think we're pretty well positioned to do what Mr. Lipson's talking about. The board, having an independent board, I think is really important. So that really is the Tiger team, right? That's the entity that has the direct responsibility, and they don't have the vested interests in the property. So we know that agencies oftentimes don't want to suggest properties for sale. So the board doesn't have that baggage, and they now have the ability with the appropriation to hire the type of expertise that they need to put together actionable recommendations. And we're going to be passing to them some ideas and a lot of data, but they're really going to need to have people in their control to package that into actionable recommendations. And I think that's one of the quickest thing that we can do to make this successful is to make that board successful. And then perhaps longer term or for us, for GSA, the fact that we now have insight into utilization rates, which we didn't have before, is really important for making better portfolio decisions, identifying opportunities where we can get a really significant return on investment. For example, if we restack a building, we could give up 2 leases, let's say, and then we can quantify that and come to Congress and say, look, if you can give us $15 million to restack this building, this is what we'll save annually. And because it does cost money to save money, and if we can quantify that return on investment, we got a better chance of getting the money. But also in leased locations, it'll help identify places where we can put more people in there. And with leases, we really have a tremendous opportunity to save money, because the requirement to spend money to save money, with leases, we can access that money through private capital markets, and we do it through a lease. So with 1 year's lease payment, we can leverage 20 times, up to 20 times as much money from the private sector in that lease. And when a lease expires, we have the opportunity to replace it with a lease that's 30% smaller.
One of the things I think is really important is not just having the data public, but also promoting it. I'm not sure GSA has done enough to make the public aware that this data is available. I know it's on your website here at the subcommittee, but otherwise it's kind of hard to find. If you put it into Google, federal real property, you don't come to the actual data set that's been made public. You just come to the summary library. And so I think that's really important to start to get the public aware, because once they get aware, it'll be just like Nats Park. 10 years ago it opened, and everybody was really worried that nothing was happening. There was just a bunch of holes in the ground. Well, I was there last night, and now things have really been built up. So it does take some time if GSA takes the time and effort to make the public aware of the data.
I would also add, I'm sorry, in regards to the board composition and creation and its establishment, we need to understand as a key driver there the benchmark and standards that will be used by this board. I think it's a key consideration to say when the board will make recommendations on areas, since they don't have a vested interest, what associations, external entities will they use as their opportunities of benchmarking to say a utilization rate is X in the market overall, and this is where our opportunities may lie, where there could be also an opportunity for, based upon the maintenance area that the facility is in, what categorization does that look like, what class level of facility is it, really then using external benchmarks and standards as part of the core focus of the board, I think will really help to drive some quick wins, as were mentioned earlier, in determining these are the areas where we should focus to have those good news stories. But if we don't have a composition of the board that doesn't understand the external frameworks that are available to us for the general public, they'll think that we're superseding different standards based upon the government agencies that we're engaged in. So I would just caution.
Just wanted to make the committee aware of some of the things that we would like to do to make the data more actionable. We've talked about the importance and the value of the data. So we are continually looking at the data definitions and looking at the data that is actually reported by agencies to find opportunities to make it clearer, more actionable, more consistent in terms of reporting. We recognize that the data that is out there, the public data set, is rather, it's a beginning. And so we are seeking to evolve it to make it more user-friendly. We're looking at certainly search capabilities. We want people to be able to use the data and to understand what's there. So we are looking at ways of how we can enhance the data that's available on the site. And then once we've gotten to the place where we think that it's a very good, useful tool, then we will be really, really promoting it. It's not quite where we'd ideally like it to be right now.
May I ask one last question?
Sure.
I think it was you, Mr. Lipson, who kept talking about it's not about the data, it's how you use the data. Mm-hmm. And we hear all this about the data. I think we risk falling to the ecological fallacy. You can't see the forest for the trees. So you're right, we need to be able to use that data. But one other aspect of data that I want to be sure that we have in place, I keep hearing about these wins and these high-value properties. I wonder, has the GSA developed any accounting principles for how you really determine what's going to be a win, or is this something of high value?
So the statute actually has some guidance on that.
Would you help me with that?
And so I'm trying to remember. Joanna probably knows better than I do, actually. So the high value is the first round of property sales. There's a minimum requirement that we put forward, or the board puts forward, $500 million market value worth of recommendations, and it's capped at $750 million. So that first round has a different set of rules that apply to it than the subsequent round. So they basically can go to sale more quickly. And so there's a short timetable as well. So the practical reality, what we're looking for those high value sales are things that can happen quickly. So it's land, it's air rights, they are properties that are being vacated for whatever, some of those other reasons that I described. So we know at a date certain that meets the timetable of that first round of the fastest sales, we'll have a free and clear property available to sell. So there's not much expense in actually selling it. It's as fast as we can get to a quick sale with mostly proceeds. That's what we're
The fast sale.
those are the,
the best sale.
those are the, well,
Not always. Best Buy.
no. What I mean by that is it's an unencumbered piece of property. You know, I could pick 20 properties here in DC that we just couldn't be in a place to sell it on the timetable of the legislation because it's occupied. We'd have to get them off of it. Maybe there's some environmental cleanup. There could be a variety of reasons why we just couldn't bring a property to sale on the timetable that first high-value round. And so we're looking for those properties that can meet those requirements, most specifically the timetable that we have under the law.
Thank you.
The law also required that GAO watch GSA and the agencies, first of all, to make sure they follow the criteria in identifying those high-value leases, and then also, most importantly, that the agencies actually sell those properties once they've been identified by the board. So we're on the job.
Well, I hope we can we all can agree that the release of the FRPP database was a major win for transparency. But I also hope that we can agree that we must now turn data into action. 10 years from now, are we just going to see a number of new GAO reports detailing how the data can be improved? Or are we going to see a record of achievements, sales, redevelopments, consolidations that save the taxpayer money? I am committed to working with GSA and other stakeholders to ensure that the latter occurs. Are there any other comments anyone would like to make? Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to be part of this very important roundtable. This roundtable is concluded.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nicely done.
I give all this back to you.
It was nice to meet you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have my purse over there. I'll get it
That's
for you.
fine. No, that's fine. No, I enjoyed it.
That was great.
We are, aren't we? I knew you had, I didn't know it was you, but I knew you had an office. Yeah, we had talked.